Okay, just a reminder to go back on video. We are starting in a minute. Okay, just a reminder to go back on video. We are starting in a minute. Okay, just a reminder to go back on video. We are starting in a minute. All right. Let me. Good morning, everybody. I see that we have the attendees joining the part 2 of Doing Deals in Uncertain Times webinar by AVCA. I'll give about 1 minute to have everybody join on, and then we will kick it off. Great, thank you for joining us this morning, the 2nd of April. As we are all aware, the current novel coronavirus crisis is already having significant impact on the finance operations and demand for businesses and investors around the world. While there are many uncertainties, what is certain is the need for strong, effective businesses that will continue to rise despite this pandemic. So we're glad to have you all join us today for this webinar panel. As we well know, many experienced investors in East Africa, for them, a crisis is not an uncharted territory, but this outbreak is fundamentally unique in its disruption of core working processes. We're delighted to be joined by a panel of speakers, leading regional advisors, who will take us through various themes and topics that have come out within the EABC membership. And I'll give it to Kanini to take it from here, who will be our moderator today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Esther, and thank you very much, IAFCA, for organizing this webinar during these uncertain times. Just a quick introduction on who I am. I'm the Managing Director of Tonic Impact Network, which is a network of about 300 global high net worth investors and family offices based out of London and San Francisco. And we represent about $20 billion in investable assets. And I am a Kenyan, born and bred, and I'm just really excited to lead this discussion today. So I'll just start off with a brief introduction and then introduce our panel members. Welcome, everyone. So could everybody please mute their microphones, because we can hear a lot of background noise. Thank you. So as Esther said, we are living in unprecedented times right now. And we are seeing what some would call a black swan event. I think this has been talked about quite a lot in the media. And if you think about what constitutes a black swan event, it's normally an event that is has potentially outsized negative consequences. And the investor and mathematician who came up with this concept talked about 3 key characteristics that a black swan event must adhere to. First, it must be unpredictable to the observer. Secondly, the event must have widespread ramifications. And thirdly, the event has to have occurred, after which people will assert that the event was indeed explainable and predictable. Now, this gentleman's name was Taleb, and his advice is that when we're in the midst of a black swan event, we have to use the time to exploit positive consequences, but at the same time, minimize the negative consequences that we're seeing. Now, we don't know if COVID-19 pre or post will end up being a black swan event, but I think from what we're all seeing, if it looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, it quite likely is a duck. So I think to a large extent, this is a black swan event. So this discussion will focus on doing deals largely in East Africa, the East Africa private equity market, and starting to understand how this sector is managing the environment, what they're doing differently, how they will minimize negative consequences and maximize on positive opportunities going forward. I'm really pleased to have some fantastic folks on this discussion. Just to introduce them, we have Shah, who's a partner at Bowmans. That's a legal firm based in East Africa. We have Ananya Sengupta, who's the head of transactions advisory at PricewaterhouseCoopers. We have Charles Obanga, who is the managing principal at Horizon Capital, and Nigel Smith, who is the head of strategy and deal advisory at KPMG. So welcome, everyone. Just in terms of logistics, if you would like to ask a question as we're having a discussion, please put it in the chat function or in the Q&A section that you see on your screens. We will not be having people jump in during the discussion. So to start us off, I wanted to invite Ananya to give us a little bit of a lay of the land in terms of where the private equity sector in East Africa is at. When you look at the S&P, the public equities market globally, you know, the numbers look horrific. The S&P is at its worst level since 1987. The Nairobi Stock Exchange is at its lowest level since as well, about 17, 18 years. It would be great to understand, just from an overall standpoint, what the pulse of the private equity industry is in East Africa at the moment. Ananya.
Thanks. Yes, as both Esther and Kalini have said, we are in uncharted waters at the moment. This COVID outbreak is causing significant concern and hardship to all kinds of businesses across the globe. So we're all in the same boat, and this is quite unprecedented. We've never had in our living memory something that has impacted the globe perhaps in this way and so quickly. So, and the situation is changing really fast as well, and with widespread impact on businesses across functions. So it's impacting workforces, it's impacting operations and supply chain, finance and liquidity, very, very important. And overall, it's then forcing businesses to rethink their strategy and having to predict, and forecast in when they really don't know how this is going to play out. So businesses do have business continuity plans, but usually they don't address this sort of thing. I mean, they would address things like cyber incidents and power outages, but nothing like the shutdown that we have seen in some parts of the globe that we may see in Kenya at some point. Closures of schools and closures of some businesses and for extended periods, travel restrictions. We've never had something like that before. So in PwC, we did a CFO Pulse survey. This was US and Mexico, about 50 CFOs. And their top concerns were around 84% were concerned about global recession happening. 64% were concerned about financial impact, and 45% were concerned about the decrease in consumer consumption and confidence. So in Kenya, it's in the early days. We haven't even dipped our toes in the water yet, but we've already started to feel the impact. And it's very clear, I think, that if the pandemic is prolonged, then the adverse effects would really be significant. And are we really geared up to withstand such shocks? So PE firms would be facing a situation in which they have a number of underlying companies with hundreds and maybe even thousands of employees looking for guidance and direction during this crisis. And they also have to answer to stakeholders who expect returns in a relatively short period. So what do they do? What can they do in such a situation to help their portfolio companies and yet not let this destroy value to the extent that that is possible?
So Ananya, just sorry to interrupt, just quickly, could you just deep dive on fundraising specifically in terms of how that is going to impact the private equity industry in East Africa, just keeping in mind that most of their limited partners, the shareholders and the funds are largely development finance institutions, high net worth individuals who are from the US and Europe rather than local. So just give us a flavor of what impact you'll have there.
Yeah. Okay, so far what we have seen is that because it's still early days in Kenya at least, or in East Africa, people are still willing to engage. We are advising clients on fundraising, both corporates and PEs, and clients are still and investors are still willing to engage. Now, we are not yet sure exactly how this will play out in terms of their ability to complete transactions quickly. And we anticipate that definitely if this goes on for a prolonged period of time, which it looks like it will, there would be delays in transactions closing. But so far, at least, we have not seen people saying, oh, we don't even want to talk about it. Let's just wait until the outbreak is over. What we are seeing is, okay, well, let's chat, let's explore. But clearly, if there is, so for PEs in the middle of fundraising, I think we're kind of taking a let's proceed until we are not able to anymore. But for clients who have not yet started transactions, then that needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to see whether it really is worth then making that time investment now, or whether they should wait. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, it will have to be evaluated. But so far, we are not, in this market, so far, we have not seen people just saying, but that's because it's early days. The situation may very well be different in a month's time if this still goes on. And,
absolutely. Absolutely. And we don't expect you to have like a crystal ball. I mean, if we all had one, we'd not be in this situation. I want to bring in Charles as well, because obviously, Charles, you're also running an advisory business. Would you like to add anything to what Anyanya just talked about in terms of the overall environment that you're seeing with your client base?
Thanks very much, Kanini. I think the sheer speed at which we're seeing the shocks going through means that a number of us haven't even had a lot of time to actually engage properly with clients. I anticipate in the next couple of weeks across East Africa, because we're largely sort of in the same issue from a time perspective, that clients are going to be saying, let's wait and see. That causes deal delays where deals are already in motion, and that we're experiencing already. I think the biggest requests that we've seen so far from investors where we're running transactions is the need to scenario plan immediately, right? So there's a lot of work going into various scenario plans, and the scenario plans obviously revolving around how long is this going to take, and what impact does this have on the underlying business. I think the issue if protracted, obviously, means that some deals will fall away. Some deals will be to a great extent
Charles, I think we've lost you a little bit. You've frozen.
sorry, can you hear
Okay.
me now again?
We can hear you.
So I think it all depends on where we are now in a few weeks going forward. I just also probably want to also mention that in some of these underlying businesses, a lot will depend on what their banks do with them, and that impacts the investors quite a bit. And so we're seeing quite a number of requests for these businesses to engage quickly and positively with their banks, so that the investors have a good feel of what direction transactions will go.
Okay, no, thank you. That's helpful. And just to go back to something that Ananya mentioned, as well as Charles, around delays in terms of deals, or some deals actually falling through. You know, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is what are in Paris. It would be great to just have your input in terms of what do you see happening on the legal front. I mean, from what I've heard, the Kenyan judiciary is actually sharply difficult to put court cases through. But just tell us what as an impact, as an investor in this sector, what do you have to think about when you're getting into deals right now from a legal standpoint?
Thanks, Kamini, and good morning, everyone. Just before I get to the legal aspects, just to chip in a little bit on the previous conversation on what I'm seeing right now in the landscape. The deals that we were working on at the beginning of the year, some are still going on, albeit a little bit slowly. People are those were in negotiation phase. People are still negotiating, and I suspect signing will be probably delayed depending on what happens with the crisis. In one or two deals that we're doing in East Africa, which involved, for example, Ethiopia and Kenya, the parties have agreed to actually bed down on the agreements but not sign. And in one specific deal, we've managed to negotiate a pretty strong material adverse change clause, which says if we do sign and the impact of the pandemic is such that the business isn't what it is, and by the time we get to completion, then people can walk away. So negotiations are changing from a deal transaction point of view as we speak. We have seen a slight slowdown in kind of deal making across Africa, not just in Kenya. But at the same time, we are still seeing European and American investors still sending in inquiries and I guess looking at the long term. So that's kind of the landscape. From a purely East African legal point of view, the judiciary is kind of semi-open. The one good thing about a crisis is that it makes people think differently, and we're seeing online courts. The first one, I think yesterday or the day before, hearing happened, or is about to happen, I think. We've received rulings or judgments online as well from judges. So things are still slowly moving, and actually as people adapt to technology, I think it may well be quite positive for a country like ours. In terms of the various registries, and this is where we fall into a little bit of trouble, because if you're doing a due diligence and need to verify certain things at different registries, whether it's lands or companies or wherever, those are closed. And only very limited online access available to those. So that will obviously impact a lot on deals. And then things like paying stamp duty, whereas you can pay online, it's physically impossible to stamp right now, documents. So lots of challenges in terms of the logistics of getting transaction documents finalized, executed, stamped, and registered, etc. But being a little bit of an optimist, I think this is really the opportunity for people like, or for countries like Kenya to shine a little bit with the use of technology. And we'll probably, if this thing sustains itself, which is likely for at least a month or two, we might start seeing the government agencies being a bit more proactive and getting alternative means of getting things done. Lastly, I should mention regulators, such as the Competition Authority and others who are very relevant to PE deals, have also adapted technology and allowed online filings. And so nothing is stopping from that point of view if there are transactions that were signed and are going to closing mode. There may be a bit of a slowdown in terms of getting the approvals, but government agencies quite impressively have said that they're continuing to work as best as they can.
Mm-hmm.
That's the landscape on the legal side.
No, Paris, sorry, it's just, that's such great news, at a time when you hardly hear any good news. The fact that Kenyan courts are now sort of moving to be more online, you're getting online judgments coming through, and business slowly is continuing, although at a different sort of pace. I think that's great news. Just on this issue of innovation, and I'd also like to bring in Nigel to this discussion. I mean, the issue right now with this sector is that due diligence will become virtually impossible because it is very difficult to physically move from one place to another if you're looking at a new deal. So I'd like to find out from Nigel and as well as from others, is there any innovation that you see around due diligence that will not require travel and maybe doing much more shared due diligence amongst co-investors? So let me hear a little bit from Nigel, and then Paris, it'd be interesting to hear what the legal ramifications of that would be.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Actually, we haven't seen the slowdown in that. Actually, we've seen an increase in volume of work, perversely, because a lot of the PE houses themselves are unable to come into the jurisdiction and undertake their own due diligence. So, for instance, this week we've had 2 or 3 inquiries at KPMG to assist them with people that we have on the ground. So where we have offices, and obviously we do across the globe, we are able to mobilize teams to do that. Equally, however, there's a lot of information, as Paris has said, on the legal side, there's a lot of information on the financial side which can be uploaded into a data room. And we are currently working with one transaction which we hope will be completed within the next 6 to 7 weeks. We have done a lot of work over last weekend digitalizing some of the hard copy files. We've uploaded that into data rooms, and that is working a lot better and a lot more efficiently than perhaps we had feared. So those fears at the moment, Kenny, are not necessarily seen on the ground. I think we have moved perhaps more than we've given ourselves credit for into the digitalized space. I think perhaps in the past we haven't used it as much as perhaps we could have done. And maybe the one shining light out of all of this is that people are encouraged to use the IT platforms that are readily available.
Excellent. That's again another piece of great news that we need right now. Now, Nigel, just to pick up on an additional question, and I think this question can't be resolved with innovation, to be honest. So I think the question on everyone's mind is the impact of COVID-19 on liquidity. Charles mentioned the issue around banks will have to be probably listening more carefully to their clients to understand liquidity needs. But from a private equity standpoint, in Europe, which is a market that I'm closer to at the moment, we've had about 2 LPs who have defaulted on their capital calls. There's a large European pension fund that we're expecting to default anytime right now. So could you talk to us a little bit about whether you see this happening in the East African market? What is the likelihood, the probability of this happening? And Charles, I'd also like you to jump in on this as well.
Well, on the grounds that you congratulated me on being positive on the last question, you very quickly led into a more negative aspect. Clearly, there is no hiding from the fact that liquidity is a major concern, not just across Kenya and East Africa, but across the globe. This is not an East African situation. This is something which is affecting every sector, every individual, every business in every country, and we just can't get away from that. I think one of the things which perhaps has been astonishing, and in my personal view, a negative, is that where you have countries that have been expected to be working together, like in the European Union, the actions that their individual governments have taken seem, from the outside anyway, to be more insular looking and looking after their own geography rather than necessarily Europe as a whole. And I think that is not going to help the liquidity position. We had a webinar last Friday at KPMG, and the majority of participants on there had indicated that, that their receipts last week had decreased by 50% or more. Now that, as Charles said, is something which has hit home very, very quickly. The impact could never have been forecast. And as such, people are running around for liquidity. Charles is right that clearly there has been central bank guidance for lenders to try and assist their companies. There has been guidelines to prevent enforcement or suggesting that enforcement actions do not take place. That's all very well and good, but equally we have to understand that the banking system itself was not fully awash with liquidity before this started. It was estimated by certain commentators that there are at least 14 or 15 banks, and potentially more, in Kenya alone that are supported by the central bank emergency funding. That may well increase as time moves on. So it isn't as though the banks themselves have a bottomless pit on liquidity that they can pour into the market. I think one of the other areas which is affecting liquidity, perhaps more than in other parts of the world, certainly if the pandemic does expand as it has in other parts, and I hope to goodness that does not take place here. But obviously we have seen a lot of support in the US and a lot of support across Europe, and I include the UK in that, where the governments have actually boosted the economy. Now, in my personal opinion, we have to say that the government of Kenya has acted very fast and acted very quickly, and you have to give them 10 out of 10 for that in trying to restrict the expansion of COVID-19. But on the actual financial support of SMEs and the businesses in particular, and people and workforce, clearly the government is unable to provide the same degree of support as is seen in other parts of the world, where we've seen 70 and 80% of workforce average salaries to be funded over the next 3 months by their particular government. Now, we don't have that in East Africa. We have a population that lives hand to mouth, and therefore one of the real things that I'm actually concerned about here is that even though we have an awful lot of underlying companies that were very strong, and we've come up, and I'm sure other people have, with terms like EBITDA-C, where the C is pre-COVID-19. But we are now in a position where cash is being retained, and where everyone hoards cash, and I fully understand why one would do that, that actually stops the supply chain, it stops the end users, it stops workforce being able to purchase things. And if we're not careful, it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy that liquidity just completely and utterly dries up. So Nigel, just as a follow-up question to this issue of liquidity, we've talked about governments, we've talked about banks. I think one thing that hasn't been discussed here is high net worth individuals who are LPs in some of the funds that we have in East Africa. So the fact that personal portfolios have had a probably 30 to 40% hit in the last month means that there will be stifling liquidity coming from high net worth. Could you just
talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I think one has to distinguish when you're talking about LPs between the multinational LPs and high net worth individuals. I think that the two are completely different. There's no doubt that high net worth individuals are the ones that are likely to have more pressures. They're more likely to default than the multinational organizations that probably have resources behind them. On the high net worth individuals, however, there is also the opportunity that for those that do have the cash to buy into assets which are relatively cheap at the current moment in time. So it is a two-way street there. I do foresee, in fact, we are aware from a couple of PE funds that have contacted us that we know that some of their LPs are contacting them asking when is the timing of the next cash call. Now, clearly the arrangements with LPs can be fairly draconian in that, we all know that they are committed over the lifetime of the fund. Normally they only have 10 to 14 days in which to provide the liquidity. And I think we will see signs here that the PE houses themselves need to also show a degree of flexibility to the LPs, and rather than hold them to that 10 or 14 day deadline, maybe try and provide some degree of extension to see if that can be sufficient to raise the capital. Equally, we have been in discussions with people who are looking at parallel calls in order to cover any shortfall. But I think there is no doubt, and I think as Charles said earlier, that where liquidity is truly an issue, then if you do need to talk to your lenders and other stakeholders, firstly, be prepared by having proper forecasts in front of you, and secondly, try and get in as quickly as you possibly can.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Nigel. A question has just come through the chat, again, on the legal side. So it seems people are very conscious about this. So this is about force majeure and the fact that this is a clause that a lot of people will be sort of leaning on, especially SMEs. I've had discussions with SMEs who are struggling with rental payments and they want to enforce the force majeure clauses to stop paying rent, for example. Is there anything you can give, Paraz, in terms of how to navigate that in particular in this environment?
Sure, Karini. Force majeure clauses have to be, first of all, you have to have a force majeure clause in a contract if you want to enforce it. And frankly, the most of the leases, for example, that we have been reviewing frantically over the last few days and weeks in Kenya do not have very robust force majeure clauses in them. So in order to invoke a force majeure clause, you have to have the force majeure. The event must have occurred, and the impact of that event must be manifested as well. You then go into notifying and suspending a contract if necessary. In most cases, we've seen the clauses are not there or are not robust enough to be invoked certainly from a rental perspective. So what we're seeing clients do on the tenant side is sit across the landlord and try and negotiate some kind of comfort. And remember, landlords also run businesses and have financial obligations and so on and so on. So you can't just have a one-way street here. So we are seeing a lot of dialogue between landlords and tenants to kind of navigate through this. Unfortunately, unlike other countries, our government hasn't really intervened in this space, particularly on the landlord-tenant side. So we don't really know what will happen. In other countries like the UK, there has been a freeze in terms of evictions or enforcement actions for leases.
So Paraz, sorry, what advice would you give, to an SME right now, sitting at home, trying to understand, how do I pay my rent? How do I get out of this clause? Because I don't have any receipts. So.
Okay, I have to be very careful here in what I say. But the reality is, look at your lease. If there is a specific clause, well and good, try and enforce it. In the likely event that you don't have a proper force majeure clause in there, then quite frankly, tell your landlord that you are not going to be able to meet your obligations. It would be ill-advised for any landlord to start taking enforcement action right now anyway. A, you can't really access the courts. B, even if you could, the courts would be fairly sympathetic towards tenants. So landlords would no doubt be forced to come to the table and start talking to their tenants. So that's what I would advise. Just get into a dialogue and say, listen, we just can't meet our obligations. What do you want us to do? And I think most people will be sensible.
No, that's you're a lawyer and you have to be careful. I know you have to be careful as a lawyer. So that is fantastic, straightforward advice. Really appreciate it. I'm going to ask Charles and Alanya if they have anything to add on these two questions of the legal side and the liquidity piece that Nigel touched on.
Yeah, a quick one on the liquidity side. A number of the LPs are DFIs, and most DFIs generally have some emergency response funds that they create in situations like this. So, for example, IFC had done one for Ebola, they've done one for COVID. I think AFDB has also put together something. So most DFIs will probably end up having some sort of a fund which is intended to help their investee companies, draw down some emergency funding to tide over such situations. So it could be working capital funding, or it could be loans, or it just depends on the situation and the mandate of that fund. But that is probably an area where PEs might want to speak to their LPs about if they find their investee companies in trouble. That could be a pool of funds that they could draw on.
Charles?
There. I know, Kanini, that there have been defaults in Europe, and as Ananya says, most of the limited partners here are DFIs. I'd be surprised if some of these long-standing and reputable DFIs defaulted, but I will not be surprised if they enhance their due diligence before they're actually committing funds now. I'll not be surprised if decisions take longer, as I've mentioned before. And I do think that when you look at East African high net worths, you have to remember that they're also businessmen in their own right and are impacted as well in their own businesses. So I do see them taking a good look at their documentation and before having to actually pony up.
Okay, that's great. So maybe we could sort of move to, again, I'm just trying as much as I can to be positive. I'm a natural optimist, and I would like us to have a discussion about opportunities. So any new emerging sectors from the private equity industry that we see coming through post-COVID-19. If you look at the KPMG report, the typical sectors that private equity has deployed capital to in East Africa has largely been agribusiness, financial services, and fast-moving consumer goods. So I'd like to hear from you all whether healthcare, for example, is going to start to become much more interesting for the private equity sector, even if it's technically much more attractive for impact investors who are looking for social returns rather than financial returns. So I'd just like to hear from, maybe let's start off with you, Charles. What's your view? And then we can go to Nigel.
Yeah, I think that pharmaceuticals, healthcare, anyone in the manufacturing space at a local level is certainly, unfortunately, going to do well, if I could use those words, right? I think that those have been attractive spaces in there beforehand, but ever so more now as we go through this pandemic. I think if I were to add to that, in the online education businesses, probably online entertainment, if you look at where we are right now, I see increased probable interest in life and medical insurance now, and those were already businesses where there was already interest, sparking even more interest as we speak. I think that, if I may add, I think the issue with this pandemic is that it has caused us to look amongst ourselves for solutions. Nobody else is bothered with the issues of Kenya's COVID problems, apart from Kenyans right now. And what that means is that we will see increased local solutions, local manufacturing. We will see a lot more government support to local solutions, which I think can only spell good for investors as they're looking for opportunities.
So, Charles, you don't see any shift in terms of, I think a lot of us have been looking at the death numbers every single day, and it is absolutely atrocious and horrific to see 5,000 people dying within a span of 30 days. And in some spaces and some quarters, people have said that having such a close connection or seeing people dying at this rate may shift the mindset of people in, especially this sector, the private equity sector that is very much focused on profit first, financial returns first, and very little focus on the social side. Do you see this changing in any way?
Ever more so now, I think we're becoming a lot more human, right? And I think that even entrepreneurs, as they are going about their businesses going forward, will be thinking, how much more can I do? And that obviously then tails back to who they look at from an investment perspective. I think they will choose wisely now when they're looking at one private equity group versus another, if that were the case. And I think those with strong social impact initiatives and policies would obviously win out.
Nigel, do you see the industry getting softer, getting a softer heart, or do you think you're past that?
I think going forward, there is no doubt the industry will become softer. I think, to be fair to the industry, it's become softer over the 4 or 5 years. I think the difficulty that people have got with their current investments is, of course, that they're tied into current arrangements with current returns which have to be delivered. So I think there's going to be a different approach for new deals and new funds rather than the existing ones, which clearly are already fully contracted. I would endorse what Charles is saying, that on the sectors, I don't think necessarily there are new sectors that are coming to the market which are going to be the silver bullet, but there are going to be sectors which definitely are winners. But I would also be of the opinion that even in those sectors that are struggling and are going to struggle, there are going to be winners in those sectors as well. I think it's all too easy for financiers to just look at sectors and say that is a sector we wish to back, and this sector we wish to come out of. I think there are going to be winners and losers in all sectors, and it's up to the investors to pick those. And as I said right at the beginning, I think there are opportunities because the asset prices now are definitively going to be lower than they were 4 or 5 weeks ago. On the impact that you mentioned, I think one of the things which I'd be interested to hear Charles's view on is a lot of the impact funds still require 3 or 5 years trading. And I just wonder whether there'll be a move in the impact area for some of the impact funds to come in more at the seed level.
Kanini, can I just make one comment, perhaps just also for Nigel and Charles to give their thoughts on, is the possible positive impact of certain tax measures that the government has said it will implement, although they haven't been implemented fully yet. But assuming corporate tax rates go down by such a significant amount, and we've been told that we sustain post-COVID, I see that as a very positive thing post-COVID for investments in our region. Certainly.
I completely agree with that.
That's interesting.
I completely agree with that. And that's what I was alluding to earlier when I was saying that you have to give the government of Kenya 10 out of 10 for the attempt to stop the virus spreading. And you've also got to give them a pat on the back for some of the inputs that they've put into the business sector. I think the areas where clearly the Kenyan government are unable to match US and UK are the subsidising or paying of the workforce salaries, which has clearly been massively promoted in other parts of the world. So I think that's the area of uncertainty, but there is no doubt that the quick action on tax, which came into play yesterday, so on the tax front, that is current. Some of the other measures that have been mentioned on the income tax ratios, etc. I think that the government is sitting, Parliament is sitting today, and hopefully we should get a resolution of that later on today, Paris.
Great, that's fantastic. Just to pick up on some questions that are coming through the chat. Somebody has asked, and this is for Paras, whether we can start to see, or we will start to see, pandemic clauses being included, because, and it's great if you give us an understanding, Paras. Currently, there are no pandemic specific clauses because obviously nobody expected this to happen. Do you see this changing going forward now that we've come to face with this, with COVID-19 and its impacts?
Yeah, definitely. You'll see drafting coming in to cater for this kind of situation. Now, remember, we've had in the past material adverse change or material adverse effect clauses anyway. Some have been fairly general, and you could somehow interpret them to include things like pandemic, which are unexpected or beyond people's control. So they were always there. But I can tell you, we specifically drafted a fairly robust one a week ago, which has been accepted by the parties. And in effect, you're going to start seeing more specific items in MAC clauses. For example, things like disruption in supply chains or distribution chains, or forced closures of businesses for a prolonged state that may lead people to walk away from deals. So certainly from an M&A point of view, you're going to start seeing MAC clauses being a lot more specific about the impact, not just of pandemics, but actually now looking at it more about natural causes, which we're going to see inevitably more and more of with climate change. And I think people have woken up to that fact.
Okay, very helpful. Would anybody, Ananya, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just on the sectors and the impact matter that you brought up, I also agree that I think there will be more impact-focused funds. We've already seen quite a number of them, but maybe even mainstream PEs will start moving into impact-focused funds. I certainly hope so. I believe that it will. I also hope that we will see a lot more VC-type funding. Because we definitely need that to foster innovation in healthcare and particularly on the technology side. So again, I think there's a huge demand for that, and that has been really highlighted with this pandemic, and hopefully then now that will become more in focus. Another sector where I think it's not in focus right now because we are also busy with the pandemic, but I think when things quieten down, we'll realize how important clean tech is going to be, because a few days and weeks of shutdown have really shown a huge improvement in the environment and climate. And I think when people start to analyze that data, they will see it will just bring that into focus. And I feel that there will be a lot of that will be another area of possible innovation and investment.
Excellent. And Ananya, just to pick up on a point that you mentioned around impact-focused funds, when I look at our attendees today, I do see a couple of who are either in the midst of fundraising as emerging fund managers or have been fundraising for a while, and we're hoping to close in the next year and a half. What advice would you give them, just based on what you said? Should they hunker down and stop fundraising and wait for things to boil over? Should they keep going? Should they take a break? Just give us a view of what you think emerging fund managers should do in this space.
So if they're already in the middle of fundraising, they need to realistically evaluate their timelines, but I don't think immediately there is any reason to completely stop. Because as long as their investors are still willing to engage, they should be engaging. But as soon as they start to do that, they will get a sense of how realistic it is in terms of closing timelines and things like that. So that they may have to reevaluate that. But I wouldn't just say that if you're in the middle of fundraising, just stop everything. But if you hadn't started fundraising and you were planning to start, in a month's time, maybe wait and watch, and engage only after things have quietened down.
Okay, all right, that's fantastic. Anyone else wants to add on that piece on emerging fund managers, specifically in the Africa context? No more encouraging words for the fund managers. Okay, a question that's come in and is specifically for Charles, just around valuations, and where you see this going in terms of, obviously, companies are going to take a huge valuation hit. And what happens when people are in the process of a negotiation and valuations start to significantly come down? How will that work in this environment?
Look, I think the issue on valuations is that we know that valuations are coming down, as you've mentioned. The primary problem I think we're going to have is convincing the business people that that's the value of their business because of what has just happened. And I think I see a lot of mismatches in expectations as discussions on valuations go on. And so I think as advisors, probably the challenge is you without knowing when we come out of the pandemic is you can't even normalize the situation within the discussions that you're having. I'd like to think that at the end of the day, the investors themselves would have to look long and hard at the company that they're investing in and take a long-term view. But of course, I know there's some pain for businessmen in terms of valuation discussions going on. As that gap between in valuations widens, I see a lot of people saying, well, let me rebuild my business and come back to the table a year or two from now. That will happen.
And just to bring in Nigel, do you think maybe when you're doing a valuation discussion, you should have pre-COVID, post-COVID, and then to sort of have a sort of way of comparing? Because obviously there will be a significant move between pre and post-COVID valuations.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm sure every one of us have come up with the EBITDAC, which is earnings before interest, tax, and COVID. And so on the one hand, you're trying to look at a position of what is the strength of the company before COVID, and the uncertainty is how long is this going to be around for, and what is the impact. So as Charles has said, and I agree 90% on everything else he said, I've agreed 100% on his last point about people coming back in a couple of years' time. We've actually got a deal at the moment where people have not walked away. They've just provided a period of 12 to 18 months for certain ratios to be hit. And if those ratios are achieved, then the deal goes ahead. So it's a contract that will happen subject to performance, rather than walking away and renegotiating in 6 or 12 months' time. And I haven't seen that before, but I can see that is something which helps bridge the gap that Charles eloquently discussed earlier.
I think, Nigel, that's a great point. So having specific sort of KPIs or milestones that are conditional in terms of these have to be hit before the deal is closed, and then making sure that once those are hit, then you can go forward. And if not, then there is a possibility of walking away, basically.
That's correct. There's also an element of getting people like ourselves to help on the monitoring of performance, because let's be honest, I think where we are today, and we can all be over negative if we wish to be. But my view of life is that if you can see it that a company is coming out of the pandemic COVID-19 situation in, let's say, 4-6 months' time, you may not need to actually wait an additional 6 months for those KPIs to be achieved, because you will have seen that there is the bounce back. And that should give people enough confidence to come to the table and stay at the table in order to conclude deals. I think what Charles is saying is correct from the buy side, in that some PE houses will see this as an opportunity, and maybe the buy side will be the part that may be semi-unrealistic on some of the values, trying to drive prices down in order to take value. And I would, if I was a buy side party, I would fully appreciate that. And we represent buy side most of the time, so I fully understand what that would be. But I think looking at this on an even basis, in the past, I suppose it would have been easy to say that the seller has unrealistic expectations. And I think only time will tell whether the expectations of either buyer or seller are going to be realistic going forward. But I see no reason to withdraw from the market. I don't.
Okay, that's great news. And I hope everyone on the call has those wonderful words from Nigel, with a very positive stand. I'd like us to just close off by talking more about the companies themselves who are part of the a private equity portfolio. And we know it's a marriage, the investees and the private equity market is really and truly a marriage. Could folks tell us, what should those companies be asking their investors for? Is it bridge financing? Should they be asking for support in cost cutting? Should they be asking for support at board level? What level of portfolio engagement should companies be insisting for right now? So maybe let me start with, Paraz, do you have a view, maybe on the legal side? What should portfolio companies be focusing on asking for right now?
Right now, I think what we're seeing, and I think what should be happening certainly, is portfolio companies coming together with fund managers to engage with, number one, banks, suppliers, and other key stakeholders in that chain, to start very robust discussions about cash flow management, cash conservation, restructuring of long-term facilities, etc. And fund managers with their networks and with their expertise can really assist portfolio companies in that respect. So that's really the first kind of issue I think that we're seeing happening. The next one will be now more kind of as we move into the 2, 3, 4 month phase where disruption will continue, is what is the long-term view and how do we start restructuring, possibly, for example, if private equity funds had put debt instruments in, how we start restructuring those, etc., etc. So more kind of long-term financial planning as well. The third thing, and sadly, is the reality of downsizing, different issues around health and safety, all the other good things that we normally look at or from an operational point of view, but are now a lot more prominent. So, for example, if you have an investment in a financial services company, particularly a bank, your governance structures need to change very quickly. You are mandated now you're obliged by the central bank now to set up a pandemic subcommittee of the board in terms of responses. And I suspect that is probably sensible for large businesses to do anyway, as we all do in our own businesses where we've set up crisis teams. So lots of things on the governance side as well that need to be looked at. There's a whole host of other stuff, but there's 2 or 3 things that I think.
Okay, any other contributions? What companies should be thinking about right now with their funders?
There's no doubt that the first thing that the PE houses should be looking at on all of their investments is to get each of the C class of all investments to reforecast, and reforecast on a basis so as to try and understand, are they ready for the impact of COVID? I know other speakers here have talked about business continuity. I think this is more about liquidity financing. It is about the people, as Paris has said, but it's liquidity and financing. It's about the tax changes, positive as well as otherwise. And I think only when they've got those forecasts will you be ready to approach third parties for support. I think you will also find, as we saw in the financial crisis 10 years or so ago, that PE houses will divide some of their assets into good and bad assets, and perhaps so where we've seen historically that PE houses have looked at things on an actuarial basis, I think a great deal of micromanaging, or certainly more micromanagement of individual assets, will have to take place. And I think that is inevitable, otherwise there is going to be diminution of value to their stakeholders.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Nigel. We're coming to the end of the webinar, and I'm just going to hand over to Esther, but just to highlight the points that the panelists have made today. Let's stay positive. Let's champion the new innovations that are being done, especially within the Kenyan government sector. Let's acknowledge that, let's respect that. And thirdly, let's make sure that we continue to take a longer term view. And my fourth one, to be honest, will be to say mental health remains completely important in this time, both for investees and for investors. So let's not forget to take care of our folks and ourselves. Esther.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists, Ananya, Charles, Nigel, and Paris, for sharing all your insights. And thank you to our moderator, Kanini, for guiding the discussion. You did it really well. As investors and businesses attempt to navigate these unprecedented times, the IAVCA will continue to host discussions and to share resources to address the needs to continue performing through uncertainty. So far, we've hosted a two-part web panel discussion titled Doing Deals in Uncertain Times. This being the second part. If you missed out the first discussion, do check out the EAVCA YouTube channel for last week's recording, where we'll also upload a recording of today's discussion. Should you have any specific topics, concerns, themes that you'd like addressed in upcoming webinars, feel free to email me at esther@eavca.org, which is esther@eavca.org. But more than anything, I hope you're keeping safe. I wish you all continued health and safety in this challenging time, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Esther.